You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
It's episode 239 of the Author Stories Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. You can find links to all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com, and over in the right-hand sidebar there's some handy links that you can use to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcast or Android, or by email or Stitcher Radio, or the basic RSS feed is there as well for any podcast catcher app you can use there. There's also some handy links to join our Facebook group and to find us on social media everywhere. Instagram, Author Stories Podcast. Twitter, I'm Hank the Writer. And our Facebook group is facebook.com/groups/Author Stories Podcast. Come join us. We have some awesome stuff going on over there at the Facebook group. I'd like to thank our sponsors today for bringing you this awesome show. And it's because of our wonderful sponsors that I'm able to bring you so much great content. And if you would like to be a sponsor, go to hankgarner.com. Look up there in the top menu bar, and there's a link that says advertise, and you can advertise your product or service on the show as well. Today our sponsors are thirdscribe.com. Authors, you need to have a web presence so that readers can find you and you can interact with your readers. And readers, if you would like to interact with some of your favorite authors, go to thirdscribe.com. Rob and the folks there have put together an amazing community where that can happen. Go visit thirdscribe.com today. I'd like to thank our friends at The Future Chronicles. The Future Chronicles is a collection of speculative fiction anthologies where the best writers today get together and tackle a topic. Some of the most intriguing and cutting-edge fiction that's come out in the last several years has come from The Future Chronicles. There's a link over in the right-hand sidebar of the show. Go check them out. Also, my good friends at Keystroke Medium, one of the best writing YouTube podcast around. They do a live show every Monday, and you never know what's going to happen. They have some of the best guests and also bring some of the best information to writers who are publishing today. Keystroke Medium. Click on the link in the sidebar. Also, at the end of the show, we're going to have an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Don't miss our Halloween special at the end of this month with Richard Gleaves. As a matter of fact, it's going to be our third annual, and we love doing these spooky shows. So join us then.
Thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today I'm really excited to have Tricia Goyer on the show with me. Tricia is one of the most prolific authors I've ever met, and she writes in such a wide range of genres and subgenres, and kind of really across the spectrum. And so I hope that you will enjoy this show as much as I am. So thank you for joining me today, Tricia.
Thanks for having me, Hank. It's great being here.
Thank you. I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
I wasn't even interested or even thought that I could be a writer or storyteller until I was already married and pregnant with my second baby. I was actually in a nursery at church with a friend, and she told me that she was working on a novel. And when she said that, like, something just lit up inside me. I had grown up loving to read, and which is funny because I grew up in a home with no books. My mom didn't read, my stepdad didn't read, but around the 6th grade, we moved near a library. And that was like, I had discovered this whole new world. And every day I was taking home books and reading them, and just loved books so much. But I planned to be a school teacher. A teen pregnancy got me sidelined away from that, and ended up getting married and having 2 kids. So by the time she told me, I just thought, wow, that's maybe something I could do from home. And, I had a year and a half of college under my belt. I was a stay-at-home mom, and we attended a writers' conference about the following year. And, if it would have been the most likely not to become a writer, that would have been me at that writers' conference. But I had a passion and I love books.
Well, my I used to ask, what's your first memory of wanting to be a writer, and I added or storyteller to it because my friend Craig Johnson, who writes the Walt Longmire mystery series, really kind of opened my eyes to the fact that there's a long tradition of storytelling that's not necessarily writing, but that has such a huge impact on our culture and our society and we as humans and how we communicate with each other and all of that kind of stuff. So and not everyone desires to sit down and type out a book per se, but there's something about finding ways to share new things about the human experience. And so when your friend mentioned to you that she was doing that and it kind of opened up a whole new level of possibilities, do you feel like that it just awakened something that was already there?
Absolutely. So, I mentioned reading all these books, but also I had my little red tape recorder with a microphone.
Oh, nice.
So I would pretend to do like interviews, like newscast interviews. I would also sketch and think of my future family and what we would do. So I was creating in different ways. I'd never just put it together that I could actually write books and do that with my life. My brother, we would play games and I would sit him down and I'd make up this whole scenario for adventures. And so really I was doing a lot of creating as a child, but never really put it together that I could actually not really make a living, but to do that was for my future.
When you discovered the library near your house and you started carting out books, by the truckload, what sorts of things were the things that really captured your attention?
Oh, I love Nancy Drew and Encyclopedia Brown. The Little House. Oh my
gosh, I've talked about Encyclopedia Brown so many times. I was a huge Encyclopedia Brown nerd.
Yes, I probably read them all 3 times.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And Little House on the Prairie, and then biographies like Helen Keller. I think I read so many books about her life, and so just really inspiring stories, adventure stories, mysteries. I probably read all the Nancy Drews at least a couple times. Hardy Boys. So just those fun, preteen books that would just devour one a day and go back and get more.
Right. So let's go back to this encounter you had with your friend at church, and she said she was writing a book.
Yes, she was working on a novel.
Okay, gotcha. And you said that it was kind of like somebody turned a light switch on for you. What was that first idea that you got?
Well, she said she lent me a book called Writer to Writer by Bodhi Taney, and I was just fascinated. How do you do this? How do you sit down and write a book? And so, at the beginning, I didn't know what I wanted to write. I came up with ideas for magazine articles. I came up with children's book story ideas, and it was just a lot of jotting down, writing stuff, kind of finding my voice, finding what I wanted to do. When I started attending writers' conferences, they were the publishers were there, editors were there, and they would say, "Oh, we're going to start a new line for teen fiction." So I would try to write a teen fiction book, and then they would say, "Oh, we're starting a new romance line." So I would try to. So really, it was just me trying to figure out. I knew I loved books and writing, but I never thought this is exactly what I want to write. But I knew I did not want to write historical fiction, because I thought that would be too much research, which is so funny because I've published more historical fiction than anything else. But at the time I thought, oh, that's too much work. And so I just was trying a lot of things. And I did well enough that I ended up getting an agent with all these bits and pieces of novels I had started. And then I ended up actually getting books to the publishing house, going before committee, but they always fell short. And so it wasn't until I was actually on a road trip with 2 friends and came across this amazing historical story from World War II that kind of was the story that launched everything. And then once I started writing historical fiction, that really just opened up so many doors for me.
How much time, Tricia, do you think went by when you started, and forget writing to market. You were trying to figure out what the market was to even know what to write to at the time when people were saying we need a teen fiction or we need a romance. And so there's obviously all this investigation that's going into kind of how the industry works and all of that. But how much time do you think went by between, trying to figure out what that is and actually landing your agent?
So my first writers conference was 1994, and I got my agent in 1997. And then, but at that time, so I took a novel to my first writers conference, a partial novel, and it needed a lot of work. And I met some wonderful critique partners that I worked with. But then I also at those conferences met magazine editors. And so I did start getting stuff published through magazines, like short little parenting articles and that sort of thing. So by the time I found my agent in 97, so it was only 3 years later, and she had just moved from being an editor to an agent. So she was kind of looking for people. I had a little bit of stuff published with magazine articles, and I'd been, attending conferences and working all these random projects. So it was the right time. I think because she was just starting out and looking for new clients, I got in probably earlier than I would have, maybe with an agent that was up and established. But she's been my agent for since 97, so 20 years. And, I've written 70 books. So it was a nice match, finally getting connected with her.
Good grief, 70 books in 20 years. Yeah, that and you homeschool 7 kids?
I homeschool 7 kids. We have 10 kids total. So I have 3 biological, and then we have adopted 7 kids. We adopted a baby 7 years ago, and then we adopted 2 from foster care 5 years ago. And then just last year, we finalized the adoption of 4 girls from foster care that are older. They're now ages 12 to 17. So I've added on kids. So I was pretty established writing by the time we started adding on all these children. But yeah, it's a challenge. I'm writing, early morning, late at night. I'll get a babysitter a couple hours a day. So, but I really think though it's benefited me as a writer because I've always had kids at home. I already had. I was actually pregnant with my 3rd when I attended my first writers conference. And so it really was, okay, I have 2 hours, it's nap time. Let me sit down and see how much I could write. And I think that actually has benefited me as a writer because I can write fast in a short amount of time. I don't have all day to get on solitaire and to scroll Facebook and to I don't have time to just waste. I just have these limited amount of times. And so I sit down and produce work. And, if you do 2 hours a day over, 365 days a year, it does add up. And I think that actually has benefited me.
Yeah. I much respect to you. Dawn and I usually have the largest family of anybody that we're talking to at any given time, with 5 kids and dogs and, stuff. And, to hear what you're doing is just incredible. But, you're absolutely right about, it's really those short windows of time that are the most important because people think if you work from home, if you're self-employed, if you're a full-time writer, if you podcast and write, you must have all the time in the world and you could just write for hours on end every day. And the reality is there's all this associated stuff around writing and around raising a family and just, being a citizen and all the things of life. And still you wind up with like the same window of time to write every day.
Absolutely.
It's really funny. And it's all about making the most out of that window of time. And that's what separates people that, that do the work and those that don't do the work is knowing how to make the most out of that window.
Yeah, I just posted on Facebook, what is keeping you from finally sitting down to write that book that you have been burning to write? And I would say half of the answer said time, which I just had to laugh because I'm like, okay, I'm homeschooling 7 children over here, people. And, so then when I see them, talking about the movies they watch or the Netflix show that they're watching one episode after another, or the video games they're playing. I'm like, okay, you have time. Everyone has time. It's just figuring out. And, I don't watch a lot of television.
Well, you're stepping on toes
yeah.
with the Netflix right now, sister.
I know. I do watch some. I'll watch a show with my older girls. We'll watch a show, one episode every night. So I do watch some, but it's a priority. It's writing's either something we're interested in, and that interest won't take you far, or something you're dedicated to. And I think those who are dedicated, when I first attended my writers conference, there was 17 of us, and we joined kind of an email prayer group. And it's so funny because, that's before Facebook private groups or any of these things. And everyone would send me like their goals, and then we'd send like prayer requests, and I would compile them, and every week I would send them out to these 17 people, and we would say, okay, you said, Robin, that you were going to write the outline for your book. Did you do it? So there's all these people encouraging you and supporting you and checking in on you, and every single one of us is published now. Every single one of us has multiple books that are published, that are working in the industry. And I think it really does, when you have accountability, when you have dedicated people around you, when you do sit down and just do the work, eventually, it may take 10, 15, 20 years, but eventually it will pay off.
Yeah. There's, the saying, and I'm going to butcher it, I'm sure, is, the harder you work, the luckier you get. A lot of times there's a luck factor that, being in the right place at the right time and meeting the right people, call that what you want, but the harder you work, the more those opportunities seem to pop up. And, when you work hard to meet new people, then you wind up meeting the right people. And, there's a lot to be said for that, for sure.
I completely agree with that. Yeah.
I want to go back just for a second. Before you wrote your first novel and stuff, you said that you wrote for some magazines and some shorter pieces like that. How important do you think that was, not only to getting your name out there, which eventually helped, obviously, to get your agent and then get published, but what do you think that did for you honing your craft as a writer?
I think it was so helpful because I don't have a college degree or, anything. I think it was, those small pieces really helped me to, write tight and to really focus on what I wanted to say. And it did build relationships. So some of the editors for magazines moved to other parts of publishing. Some became book editors, or even some of the editors that I worked with told different publishers or editors about me because I was willing to, work really hard and do a good job and get my work done on time, which is amazing. Like if you just get your work done on time and get it in there, how excited editors get about that. But so the word has gotten out about me, even from those magazine articles. And then when I started writing fiction, I got approached by the same magazines to write short stories for them. So I've been able to write short stories in their publications. So it has, and I found just in publishing, people move around so much. And so really those relationships, when you build a relationship maybe with the magazine, you never know where that person will end up years later and who they're connected with and who they recommend you to. And one of my book projects that I was able to do, I wrote the novelization of the movie Mom's Night Out.
Nice.
Which was super fun. So they sent me the movie. It was pre-released, and I was able to write it in novel form. But it was from recommendation from one of the editors that I worked with at a magazine that had just kept tabs with me over the years. And when someone asked for a recommendation, they recommended me. So it's cool to see just any relationship that you build in publishing. If you do a good job and you work hard and you turn in good work, that spreads, and you never know how that will impact you in the future.
Well, and that works for all sorts of genres and all sorts of corners of publishing. I know that you write mostly in inspirational and Christian fiction and nonfiction. That also works for people that write science fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction. There are lots of anthologies out there that you can get short stories published in, and a lot of that comes from meeting new people and networking, getting your name out there, doing some little pieces that grab people's attention that you really cannot stress the importance of just being a good member of the writing community and how far that will go.
Absolutely, and helping other people.
Exactly.
I've critiqued with other people. Now I've written endorsements for their books. It's just, and it's not a competition. I think so many times people think writers should be competitive against each other, but really, when we support each other and care for each other and build each other up, it's just amazing how we all succeed and we all do better than if we're trying to cut other people down.
Well, and the truth, Tricia, is that you and I are not competing against each other. You and I together are competing against Netflix and YouTube and Facebook.
Right. Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, it's not that someone's going to buy my book over yours or your book over, whomever else. It's that it's what we were talking about earlier, that those things that seem to suck away all of our time. And those are the biggest hurdles to the author community now, I think.
Right, absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about how you got going here. So you started writing the shorter pieces and magazines and some short fiction. What was that first novel that you landed, and kind of how did that come about for you?
Oh, I love sharing this story. So I have two friends. One that I met, one actually was the one that I first started writing with that I met in the church nursery. And then another friend, she lives in Europe, and we were part of the same online writer encouragement group. And they were going on a research trip to Europe. And here I was living in Montana at the time, just getting magazine articles and stuff published, and they invited me to go along for the research trip. I'm like, yes, that'd be awesome. And left my husband and 3 kids at home for a week, and we went to Europe and traveled around. And they were both researching for novels. And my one friend, Anne, kept saying, I really think there's going to be a story here for you. And I'm like, I'm just on a girls' trip, and I'm not even worried about writing right now. But then we ended up going to Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. And my friend Cindy had set up this appointment, but she turns out she was going a different direction with her book. So she really didn't need to go there, but she felt obligated since she had asked this historian to meet us there. And so we're going through Mauthausen concentration camp, which was a large camp in Austria that at the end of the war, there were about 30,000 Jews and Poles and Russians and all types of people were in this concentration camp, and just being there just was so sobering. But the historian, as she's telling us the stories about the camp, she came to the liberation, and she started telling us about the 11th Armored Division, and there was 23 men on reconnaissance that didn't even know the camp was there. And along the road, a Red Cross worker approached them and told them the camp was there, and they said that the Germans wanted to surrender to them. So because the Russians were close. The Russians were in Czechoslovakia and getting ready to cross into Austria. And so here's these 23 guys that came upon the camp, and 3,500 guards had surrendered, put down their guns, surrendered to 23 men, and the gates opened, and all these half-dead people were coming out and hugging them and thanking them and grabbing their legs, and just this moment of just they finally have freedom. And then the first person walking into the camp was a Nazi officer's wife, and she had not been happy with what her husband had been doing, and she started going in and taking care of the prisoners and bringing them food. And I just remember the story just getting chills all over as I heard it. And I turned to one friend, I turned to Anne, and I said, are you going to write about this? And she's like, no. She had another project. And I turned to Cindy, are you going to write about this? And she said, no. And I said, I would love to write about this. And I got home and talked to my agent about it. She's like, yes, you need to write this book, and you need to see if any of those men are still alive. And so I ended up getting on the 11th Armored Division website, and there's a contact information, and I asked about them. And the secretary gave me the names of 11 men were still alive, and of the original 23. I ended up writing letters to them. Because he's like, write them letters. They don't have email. They were World War II vets. And this was back in 2000. And so I wrote letters, and immediately, within a week, I got all these letters back from these men. Yes, they would love to talk to me. And they were actually having a World War II reunion in Kalamazoo, and they invited me to go up there and interview them. And so it was about 6 months later, I ended up going and interviewing them. We walked in, my friend Cindy went with me, And I told them I'd be there Thursday afternoon. We were actually driving up from Chicago, and we walk in, and this man walked up to me, and he was a younger man, and he said, "Are you the author?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "These men have been waiting all day." And he took me to this room where these men are lined up. There's about 10 of them that were able to make it to the reunion, and they were sitting there with their photo albums, with their stories that they had written up, with their mementos that they brought back from the war, and they just started pouring out their stories to me. And so that became,
Gosh.
yeah, that became my first novel, From Dust and Ashes, and it was a novelization, a fictional story of what happened. But the fun part is, I went back, the next year I went back and interviewed for another book that became my book, Night Song. But the third year, when I actually came back with my finished book in my hands and was able to show them, they started reading it and they said, "I know you say it's a fictional book, but the main character, he's really me, isn't he?" So all these men were saying the same thing. And I'm like, I know I got it right when all of them think that they are the hero of the story.
Exactly.
And so it was such a wonderful experience, and ended up writing many historical novels coming out of their stories. And so a lot of my World War True stories are based on what these guys really experienced.
I love that, Tricia. And you talked earlier about the trepidation that you felt in writing historical fiction because these stories are so important. Especially from this time period and these events that happened. You have to get those things right. These people's stories deserve to be told correctly, and for the correct honor to be given to them. And the correct weight to the atrocities, and it's super important to get these things right.
Absolutely.
But it sounds like when you found the story, when the story really opened up in your mind, that got easier. What were some of the challenges in the meantime? So after meeting, these soldiers and getting their stories and all of that, and between there and the finished book, were there ever any dark days of, oh my gosh, I can't do this? Kind of how do you work through those feelings of not feeling up to the task when tackling something that's important?
Oh, absolutely. There are times because I've interviewed in the course of 3 years over 100 veterans, and just their stories are so powerful. And then they introduced me to some Holocaust survivors, so I was able to also interview some Holocaust survivors. And I just remember sitting there, these three kids are running around the house, making a lot of noise. I'm trying to work on this book, and I'm like, why? I was like, why, God? Why am I the one? Like, there's people that have gone to college and have degrees and could do such a better job than me. And I really felt God just focusing me on the emotion of it, the eternal and internal part, both of them, were really, as a Christian, I was once locked in sin and chained in darkness, and he was the great liberator. And just tuning into, all of us have darkness in our lives. I mean, not even close to the extreme of what people placed, what they experienced in the Holocaust. But if we can think about all the people that need hope, that need encouragement, to need to find light after these dark, dark things that happen in our own lives, to kind of focus on the emotions of that while also telling a story really became my focus. And I realized that I can share, just even some of the hard stuff in my life through the main character. She was abandoned. Her husband had escaped, the real true person. Her husband had escaped to flee the Americans, and so she was abandoned by him. She was overwhelmed with the emotions. She was overwhelmed with not knowing how to care for all these things. And I had been a teen mom, and my boyfriend had, left me, and just the dark days of facing a teen pregnancy, and my friends moving on with their senior year and feeling so unsure and facing depression. So really, I channeled a lot of what I had faced. It was so minor compared to what people faced in World War II, but channeling those emotions into the book really helped. It made me realize that I can tell a story from my deep places of my heart that'll hopefully touch the deep places of other people's hearts. But then I think the other challenge that I faced, because I had interviewed so many men and there was so many amazing stories, was really focusing on the book, like focusing on, this is a story. It has, follow the hero's journey and all these things that we know in good storytelling and plotting it, because I just wanted to include everything,
Right.
which is impossible. And there's even chapters that once it went to the editor, because I would have them leave the concentration camp and go to a displaced person camp looking for family members, which were things that happened. They'd had soldiers would escort people to go to these displaced persons camp, and they're trying to find people. My editor's like, we can just cut these 2 chapters because they really slow down the story and the story doesn't change. Like, why did you include them? I'm like, because I interviewed guys and they told me about this. And so really it was, and I'm so thankful for good editors that can just say, and I think that's a part of historical fiction too. We don't need to include everything. Like, only include what is necessary for the story that keeps propelling us forward. That's focused on the character's main motivation, and not just get so bogged down. Because with history, there is so much amazing things and people and experiences. It can be overwhelming, and so that's really helped me as I've continued to write historical fiction, to plot well and to only research exactly what I know will be in the book. Because I'll just find myself on 100 rabbit trails because it's so interesting and fascinating once I start getting into it.
Tricia, one of the things that I really appreciate about your writing is, and you touched on this a little bit already, is that you're not afraid to tackle some hard subjects, some dark stuff, and to talk about things that sometimes when we're talking about matters of faith make people uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And I have another friend, Merle Temple, who was on the show a couple of months ago, and he writes crime drama, but from a place of faith, and he also doesn't pull any punches. And I think we all have read stuff that comes from an inspirational slant, and you can just hear eyes rolling when you read it because it's just not real, and it's just like, that's really contrived to make a point, and you lose the reader because it's just not good storytelling. How do you balance those two things? How do you maintain yourself as a writer, and that you're obviously writing from a particular worldview, and you have your own personal story to tell that comes out in your writing, but not doing it in such a way that turns off readers and keeps the door open to welcome people to your way of seeing things?
Right. Well, I think first of all, I plot the story as anyone would plot a story, with all the action, all the drama, all the motivation, all the conflict, so that there's that kind of the external story that is happening that does need to carry readers along. It's not, we don't want it to have a sermon and just wrap scenes around the sermon. I mean, my stories, and I think it helped because I started with World War II, which there was a lot of action, a lot of drama, a lot of conflict. The story has to make sense. It has to have the different elements of good storytelling in it. But then, because of my belief as a Christian, I also have the internal storyline that's going on. And most of my characters, well, I'd say all of them, really have struggles, have questions about faith. It's not like everything's going to turn out all right. Like, why did the Holocaust happen if there is a God? Like, these are stuff that my characters struggle with in the book. And sometimes things are answered, and sometimes they realize I don't have an answer, but I still have to trust. Or maybe I can be the difference in someone's life. Like, they come to a personal settling within their soul with each book. But, sometimes characters make wrong choices too. So it's not always everything ties up neatly at the end. But the internal story, the faith story, I think is just as important to plot out, to figure out, because people struggle. I mean, I've been following God since I was 17 years old, and there's still questions, and there's still doubts, and there's still fears and all these things. And if we try to make it a neat little package, that's not real. Like, no one, just believes in God and then has this amazing, perfect life. All of us struggle. And so I really try to show that in my characters too, that it's just as important as the internal stuff in the story as the external stuff and what's going on. And hopefully by the time the reader puts down the book, they will feel, a sense of hope that maybe even during dark times that we can turn to God and we can trust him. And if they just take like one step closer thinking that that's a possibility, then that's wonderful. Or sometimes I've had readers say, I don't believe in God, but you just help me maybe see things differently. And so that's okay too. Just realizing that there are people that have those internal struggles, and not every one of my characters in my books is a Christian or becomes a Christian. That's just reality too. So it's just kind of taking what we face in everyday life. And I think what's really helped me in that is not living in a Christian bubble. I attend an inner city church, and every Thursday night I work with teen moms. None of them are going to church. They're all just people that need help and need hope and need diapers and need baby clothes. And I just love on them. And so I think sometimes if we do get focused on being in a Christian bubble and don't realize the pain and the hardship and the struggles that people outside that Christian bubble deal with, then it gets easy to kind of get preachy in our books. But when we just interact with real people with real struggles that may not have their own faith story or would consider them a Christian, then it does help in the fiction.
I think that's an absolutely perfect answer. I love it. So after that first World War II book, that had to be a phenomenal feeling that you not only finished your first novel, but it was something that was so important, so weighty, and that you were so proud of at the end. How do you follow that up?
Well, it became both a challenge, but an easy challenge, because while I was there researching for my first novel, which is called From Dust and Ashes, I heard an amazing story by one of the guys. His name is Leroy Peterson, and he was a medic. And he talked about when he walked into the gates, there was an orchestra of prisoners that were playing. And they were playing our national anthem, and they had sewn this little flag out of scraps they had seen American bombers going over in hope for liberation. And so they started playing our national anthem. And once he said that, I thought, what an amazing story to talk about being inside an orchestra in a concentration camp. And so these were world-renowned musicians that were now prisoners and playing for the Germans. And so that became my second novel. And then while I was there researching for Night Song, talking to veterans again, I got pulled aside by a man, and he said, I'm not part of this division. I was actually in the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, and would you write a novel about us? And I said, yes. And I had no idea about the Bataan Death March. I honestly, because I'd been so focused on Europe during World War II, I didn't even understand what was happening in the South Pacific, and had no idea that Clark Field in the Philippines was bombed only 8 hours after Pearl Harbor. And the men were left there without food, without supplies, without any sort of backup, because the South Pacific Fleet had been totally destroyed. There's no one who could go help them. And so they ended up being prisoners of the Japanese. They held out for many, many months. And so I ended up writing that story. So really, it was just as I interacted with these men and listened and cared that these stories started coming along. And then again, got another idea from talking to them. So really, the World War II ideas just came, which was a wonderful thing, just to be able to share their stories. And in my second book, Night Song, I ended up talking to many medics that had been in World War II. And one of them, I interviewed him over the phone, and then he sent me part of his story, and he was so excited when my book came out. And again, I'm a mom, I have kids at home, and I was planning to get one in the mail to him. And so I had been, I got my box of books in the mail, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'll do that tomorrow. And it got to be about 2 weeks, and I still hadn't got a book to him. And then I got an email from his daughter that's saying that he'd passed away, and I was crushed. And I'm like, I am so sorry. He was so excited about the book, and my busy life, I just felt horrible for not getting to the post office to send him a copy of the book. The book was dedicated he was one of the people that I dedicated the book to. And his daughter ended up emailing me back. She's like, "Oh, honey, he got tired of waiting for you. We went to the bookstore and bought it, and he read it and loved it." And I was like so thankful because I felt, oh my goodness, he'd been waiting all this time, and then he passed away before he could read it. So I was so thankful that he was impatient and went and got the book himself and actually read it.
That's so cool. So cool. We could talk about this all day, but your writing career is so wide, and you write in so many different veins. Did you ever, even though you loved these books so much and they meant so much to you and you enjoyed gathering these stories, did you ever worry that you were going to be pigeonholed as, the lady that writes World War II historical fiction?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I never really had the chance because at the same time that I was working on my novel, my first World War II novel, I ended up getting a contract for a nonfiction book for teen moms. And the teen mom support group that I lead today, I started leading one in 2000. And so I was working with teen moms. And I would try to find books for them. And every parenting book that I found, it just didn't apply. Like people are talking about their budget and their SUV and their whatever, or, their husband, and have the kids go in and you take a bubble bath while your husband watches the kids. I mean, it just didn't apply to them.
During all this.
Yes. And I'm like, these are 16-year-olds who are trying to deal with their parents and with high school and with the boyfriend that is cheating on them. And so I end up actually going and talking to a publisher, and I actually had a chance to meet with some of the editors face to face, and I took photos of these teen moms that I work with, and some of them, 15, 16, 17 years old, and told them their stories, and I'm like, they need a book for them. And so the same year that I got a contract for my first World War II novel, I also got a contract for my first nonfiction book, which was called Life Interrupted: The Scoop on Being a Teen Mom. And then after I got my second novel, I got another nonfiction contract for another parenting book for Gen Xers. It's called Generation Next Parenting. So it was just kind of like this novel, nonfiction, which I think my storytelling from my, loving fiction kind of plays into my nonfiction. And then researching and compiling information that I do with my nonfiction benefits my fiction. So it has... Even though it seems like totally random that I'd have a World War II novel releasing and a parenting book, those are just parts of me. And so I really never got stuck in just being a World War II historical writer. And then later when Amish fiction became popular, especially in the inspirational market, I had an editor contact me and said, "Would you be interested in writing an Amish novel?" And she had emailed me, and I almost like, I probably did laugh out loud, like, I write World War II, like what? But it was funny because I told her, well, I'll think about it and I'll pray about it. And that day I remembered that my daughter, we lived in Montana, knew a family in Montana that had been Amish. And I was just like, well, that's kind of interesting that I know a family. And then my daughter and I went out to coffee later that day, and we ended up running into the young woman whose parents used to be Amish. And I'm like, I would love to hear their story. And so she's like, here's their number. And they lived about an hour and a half away up in the mountains in Montana. And so I ended up calling them and said, well, someday I'd just love to hear your story. And they said, actually, we're going to be in town tomorrow. We'll stop by. So, within 48 hours of this editor asking me if I'd be interested in writing Amish fiction, I ended up hearing this amazing story. They lost 2 daughters in a horse and buggy and semi-accident, and they ended up moving from Illinois to Montana, and just their experience with that, living in the mountains of Montana, and they ended up leaving the Amish. So, I mean, their story became the basis for this Amish novel, which again is exactly what I was doing with World War II, taking true stories and turning them into fiction. And so that kind of launched, I have written about 10, no more than that, maybe about 15 Amish novels, kind of just, again, talking to people, hearing their stories, putting them into book form. And it's fun because one of my Amish series is currently in development with a production company to be turned into a TV show. So we'll see. It's, those things Could happen, couldn't happen, but it is in development. They're working on a script now, and so it's always fun to dream and think about that it could happen, but we'll see.
Oh man, people ask sometimes where do story ideas come from, and I really hate that question because story ideas are everywhere. If you just learn to watch people and circumstances and be quiet for a little bit and listen, there are story ideas everywhere. And the thing that's more fascinating to me is which one of those story ideas come alive to the writer, and the situation like you were just talking about there with the Amish family and how all these circumstances just kind of line up, and that's the thing that comes alive to you at the time. Those things are really fascinating to me. But do you ever are you ever at a loss for story ideas?
No, not at all. But one question that I heard years ago at a writers' conference is the question I keep going back to when I figure out what to work on next. Is the workshop speaker asked, if you could only, like, if you knew you only had a year to live, what was the one book that you want to write before you died? And so when I have lists and I have ideas and I have all the time I send emails to my editor, my agent, and I'll say story idea, and then I either sometimes it's a nonfiction idea, sometimes it's a novel. She's like, that's a great idea, and so I just have a file of those. But then I sit down and think, okay, what would be, if I only had a year to live, what would be the next one that I would absolutely want to write before I died? And so it has, that answer has led me down a path of writing these different books. And so I remember the first time I asked that, I just had so many ideas and I didn't know what to pursue. And I thought about these veterans, and I thought I would love to write a story about a granddaughter taking her grandpa back to Europe, and taking him to these World War II sites and then discovering a part of his history that he regrets that she never knew about. And so that became my book, Remembering You. So it's fun to, when you ask that question, kind of the book that rises to the surface.
That is a fantastic way to kind of weigh out those all of the ideas that inundate us. Is assign a priority to it, and if this is the one thing I want to be remembered for, or the one thing that I want to make sure maybe not even I'm remembered for, but this is the story that needs to be out there that people need to read. That's a pretty good way of prioritizing.
Yeah, and sometimes it's, like I said, it's fiction. Sometimes it's nonfiction. Right. Recently, I've been writing more nonfiction. So sometimes I'm like, okay, these novels are great, but this is a message I just have to tell families or help families with or whatever. And that's the one that rises to the surface too.
Yeah. And speaking of nonfiction, your newest book is a nonfiction book. It's been out about 2 weeks since we're recording this. It's called Walk It Out. And you talked about kind of switching back and forth between fiction and nonfiction. Do you feel like having that other outlet helps the fiction in that maybe, that, okay, there's a topic that's just really on my mind. Let me go write this book and kind of work on this aspect. Do you feel like that helps your fiction in that it frees up, creatively, or just switching gears, when you do the same thing over and over again, you tend to get stale, or at least you feel like it as a writer. Being able to switch to something completely different, what does that do for your creativity?
I think it does. I think it gets out kind of the messages that I want to say. It does that, and then there's always kind of a fiction idea simmering in the back of my head, so it gives it time to simmer, kind of sort itself out in my brain. But also I found that just publishing nonfiction has actually grown my readership too. So maybe someone might pick up Walk It Out, and I even talk about my journey. One of the chapters is on the work you're meant to do, and I talk about how do you know what you're meant to do on this earth. Do you ever feel like you're hitting a wall and you're not fulfilling your purpose? And so I talk about that in this book, and I talk about writing my novels, and some of the stories that I've shared with you today are make it into my nonfiction book as examples. And then people might say, oh, I haven't written a novel in a while. Let me go check out one of her books, or I'll talk at a parenting seminar or a homeschooling workshop, and then they rush to the table and buy my novels, which I hadn't even been talking about fiction, but because they connect with me as a person and grow to trust me and hear more about my life and what I've been able to do with interviewing veterans and all these things, then they're like, oh, I want to go read one of her novels. So I think it has grown my readership too, not only creatively when I'm thinking about both different genres, but also building a readership as they will put down a nonfiction book and then maybe go pick up one of my novels.
I think writers sometimes are scared to switch genre in fear that readers won't follow them. But I really like what you said, because there are certain authors that I buy their book on release day just because I love them on their name, because I've learned to trust them. I've learned that I can expect certain things from them, and they may shift gears on me and throw me a curveball and as many other metaphors as I can mix together. But I love them and I trust them. And there's something to be said for earning your readers' trust and then trusting your readers to follow you with all of the different veins that you want to pursue.
Absolutely. And I think there's still part of me, I mean, of course, because I'm the writer, but there's part of me in the nonfiction that they also may see in a novel. So, we've adopted kids and I've written about that in parenting. And then some of my novels have dealt with people that either have adopted or are adopted. And then, there's struggles with that in novel form. And so, I think when people pick up a book, and then those readers who know me well, if, you place 20 novels in front of them, they'd be able to, without looking at the title or the cover, they'd be able to start reading and know it was one of my books, because they kind of know me, they know my heart, they know the things I write about, they know my writing style, and it's kind of the same, both fiction and nonfiction. There's me in there, and they were able to grasp that.
Yeah. Do you ever work on multiple things at the same time?
Absolutely. So,
well, as prolific as you are, I would think you have to be.
I mean, there's some years I've written 4 or 5 books. And so, I mean, I could talk about currently. So I just finished edits for a novel that's releasing in January. And then I'm doing all the book launch stuff for Walk It Out. And then I'm working on a nonfiction book that is due in a month and a half. And then my agent, I just turned in 2 proposals for books my agent is pitching. So it's almost like, okay, I have 2 hours. What do I need to do? Do I need to work on working on the book that I'm writing, or do I need to work on book launch stuff for the book that just launched, or do I need to think about future ideas and work on this book proposal? And sometimes my agent will help me weigh out those things too. It's just like, okay, I talked to editors, I pitched your idea, they want to see the proposal, and that's like, okay, I guess I'm not writing today. I guess I'm working on a book proposal. But so it is a balance of all these things. And sometimes people think, writers can go into the woods and live and just write their books and pass them under the door, and then other people are going to take care of all of that, which is so far from the truth. There's so much involved after the book releases of connecting with people and doing interviews and connecting with people online and sharing your story. And so that's all part of the process too.
So you don't live in a cabin on a hill and wear your tweed jacket while you write and throw your manuscript down the hill for your minions to handle everything after that.
That sounds like a dream.
I'm sure it'd get boring after
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, it's so funny because people say, how can you write with all these kids? And I'm like, writing is the fun part. Like, the characters do what I say. I could sit down. My room is pretty much quiet. Sometimes I could hear, shouting in the distance for my kids, but my characters will do what I say, and I could set order on the page, where my house with all these kids running around isn't always order.
I love that. Tricia, we do have a lot of writers that listen to the show, and I like sometimes to get my guests to maybe, if there's someone listening who is maybe in that position that you were 20 years ago or 23 years ago, and has just kind of not really found their footing and is not really sure of themselves. What piece of advice would you give them standing on the other side where you are now to this person who is where you were back then?
I would say that everyone begins somewhere. And so sometimes we compare ourselves as we're starting with someone's fifth novel or 10th novel or 50th novel, and just do the work daily. So do your work, sit down, write something, and it is not going to look like Nicholas Sparks right when you sit down, but if you keep working, at it, and then also surround yourself with people or even one person who is going to believe in you, support you, encourage you, not let you give up is so huge. And having that in my life, looking back now, I don't think I would be where I am today without those people that would say, hey, you said you were going to, start your new book or write a chapter or do those things. If I didn't have those people, I probably would have given up long ago. So find even one person. I mean, there's writers groups online that you could connect with if there's not someone local, but there's also local writers groups. Find those people who will encourage you so you won't give up and so you'll keep going.
Tricia, I have so enjoyed getting to talk with you today. If people have just discovered you for the first time, where can they find you online to dig into everything that you do?
Yeah, I would love to connect with them. My website is just triciagoyer.com, and Tricia's Tricia, Goyer's Goyer.com. And on Facebook, I'm author Tricia Goyer, Instagram Tricia Goyer, Twitter Tricia Goyer. So any of those places. And I really love, they could just drop me a private message in Facebook, or I have a contact information on my website. I write a lot of blogs on there, so they can read those. So I just love connecting with people. So come and connect with me.
Excellent. Well, Tricia, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much, Hank. It was great talking to you.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Tune in for new episodes every Tuesday and Friday. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I was 10 years old when I saw my first ghost. The year was 1770. My father was a barber. He kept a small shop at the Couenhoven Inn, where the King's Road met the Old Loop. Our modest home lay to the north, between the inn and the hanging tree. A simple box of pine boards whitewashed with crushed oyster shell, one room with a spinning wheel for mother, a chair for father, and up a ladder of branches, a garret where my parents slept. I slept on the floor below, alongside my little brother, Hans, 5 years younger than I. Our floor sloped toward the Hudson, so that when Hans rolled over in his sleep, he often went on rolling and couldn't stop, collecting splinters and grievances. Yet on this particular night, he slept peacefully, and I was the fitful one. A mouse had taken shelter in our wall, fleeing the October chill. It scritched and scratched, nibbling a nest for itself. The sound thrilled me. I possessed a vivid mind, full of toadstools and bullfrogs and lightning storms, and so imagined a skeleton writhed in the wood. The bones of Anne Underhill, perhaps, murdered by Indians at Spook Rock. I'd heard that tale from my father, who reveled in the Dutch superstitions. He would gather us to fireside on winter nights and spin tales of the Heer of Dunderberg, that storm king who rattled our white windows, of the Lady of Raven Rock, who died in snowfall, pining for her lover, of trolls beneath the penny bridge and hobgoblins in the hanging tree. He'd filled my head with such dark romance that I lay waiting for Anne's little finger bones to drag me off to some bloody fate. I rather hoped she would. A cloud cleared the moon, and a square of light fell on my mother's spinning wheel. The sharp spindle glinted, and the wheel began to turn, without touch. A figure appeared before me, as through a mist, a gray head bent to the work. She fixed me with eyes black as open graves and whispered in a low, guttural hiss, "Spin, or you shall not eat." I cried out and fell to my pallet, arms over my head. Hans awoke, lost his balance, and rolled away, bleating with pain as he struck the riverside wall. Father emerged above. "Agatha, What is wrong? There's a ghost, Papa. A ghost! Help me! Hans laughed despite his bruises, and Mother moaned and ordered us to sleep. But Papa descended and took my hands, his blue eyes twinkling. What did you see? An old woman. She said, "Spin or you shall not eat." Oh! He raised a candle beneath his chin. You saw old Willow. She lived here long ago, when this was the home of Isaac Hart, our candle maker. Her husband was killed by savages. Hart took her in at the request of Lord Phillips, who paid a token sum for her upkeep. But Hart was greedy, and kept the money for himself. He never fed her unless she spun. So Willow spun and spun and spun, like a spider, year by year, growing old and blind and falling to waste. She died at that spinning wheel, fell over one day, and the spindle pierced her heart. Hans screamed and hid beneath the table. Mother appeared above. Daniel Van Ripper, you are a fool. I kissed Papa's fingers, for I loathed that spinning wheel. I'd be no toothless ghost, spinning and haunting little girls. I felt pity for such a spirit, and gratitude to have her example before me, steeling my resolve. Every night thereafter, I would leave a crust of bread for old Willow, and sleep with one eye open, in case she came to spin for me again.